If there is one subject that cuts across every theatre of the Second World War, it is water. Armies can march without food longer than they can survive without clean drinking water. And during the war, this reality collided with destruction on an industrial scale. Wells were poisoned, pipes shattered, rivers polluted by fuel and bodies. In prisoner-of-war camps, lifeboats, jungle patrols and bombed cities, access to safe water could disappear overnight. What followed was not panic, but improvisation. Among the most quietly effective solutions was an emergency water still built entirely from scrap metal. It was crude, slow, and almost invisible in the historical record, yet it saved lives across continents. This guide is for those who want more than surface-level survival stories. It explains how these stills worked, why they were trusted, and how the same principles remain relevant today. This is backyard wisdom forged under wartime pressure, not theory. Why water purification became a life-or-death improvisation. You see, official military water purification tablets existed, but supply chains failed constantly. So folks really had to make do, relying on their own ingenuity to survive. Air crews shot down over the Pacific resistance fighters hiding in forests, and civilians trapped in ruins could not rely on issued gear. Water sources were often brackish, stagnant, or contaminated with fuel disease or chemicals. Boiling alone was not always enough, honestly. Salt water couldn't be made drinkable by heat alone, and chemical contamination remained a risk. Distillation, the process of evaporating water and condensing it back into liquid, offered a universal solution. The challenge was building a still with nothing but scrap. How the scrap metal water still quietly emerged during the war. The basic design of the emergency still was not invented during World War II, but the war forced it into widespread practical use. Sailors adapted it from shipboard desalination principles. Engineers stripped it down to its essentials. Prisoners and civilians learned it by observation, rumour, and trial. Now, the still itself, well, it consisted of three elements. First, a container to hold contaminated water. Second, a surface to condense vapour. And third, a channel to collect clean water. Scrap metal, you see, provided all three. Helmets mess, tins, fuel cans, bits of aircraft skin, baking trays, and even artillery shell casings were all repurposed, depending on what was available. So, why was scrap metal ideal for emergency still construction? Well, metal conducts heat efficiently, which means water could reach evaporation temperature pretty quickly, even over the smallest fires. It could be shaped, sealed, and reused again and again. But most importantly, metal doesn't absorb contaminants the way porous materials do, and that was absolutely crucial. Aluminum, which was widely available from aircraft wreckage and old cookware, became a favoured material for these makeshift stills. Steel was more common if you were scrounging around urban ruins. And even rusted metal could be pressed into service, since the distillation process separated vapour from any surface impurities. Quite ingenious, really. So, let's talk about how a typical World War II-era scrap metal still was put together. The simplest version, well, it started with a metal container filled with unsafe water, which you'd place over a heat source. Then, above that, you'd angle another metal surface to catch the rising steam. As the vapour hit this cooler surface, it would condense and then run down into a separate clean container. It's really quite ingenious when you think about it. Now, field adaptations made these stills a bit more efficient. Some setups, for example, used a sealed lid with a small outlet tube, often fashioned from metal strips or tubing scavenged from vehicles. Others, well, they used cloth or rubber seals, sometimes cut from old boots or inner tubes, to stop steam from escaping. But, you know, the goal was always the same: capture that vapour before it got away. In prisoner-of-war camps, stills were often hidden inside stoves or even buried partly underground to keep the steam out of sight. And out at sea, in lifeboats, sailors sometimes used solar heat instead, suspending metal sheets over dark containers to encourage evaporation, all without needing a fire. Pretty clever, really. Now, let's talk about what contaminants these stills could and couldn't remove. Distillation, you see, was very effective at getting rid of bacteria, parasites, sediment and salt. Really quite reliable, actually. This process made seawater drinkable and turned stagnant water into something safe. Fuel contamination, which was pretty common near battlefields, was mostly eliminated too, since petroleum compounds evaporate at different temperatures and tended to be left behind. However, experienced users knew there were still some chemicals with low boiling points that could carry over. So, when possible, the first small amount of distilled water was discarded, a practice learned the hard way through bitter experience. This little detail, which you wouldn't often find in the manuals, was shared by word of mouth among troops and survivors. As for how much water these stills could actually produce, well, a scrap metal still was no miracle machine. The output was slow, often just a few cups per hour, if that. But even so, it was enough to keep a person alive. In survival conditions, even a single litre a day could mean the difference between dehydration and staying healthy. So, how can modern survivalists, actually apply this wartime knowledge? The principles, well, they remain unchanged. A backyard or emergency still can be built using metal pots, lids and tubing that are honestly still available today. Controlled heat, proper condensation angles and clean collection containers. Those are really the key things. And learning to build and operate one before you actually need it, well, that mirrors the wartime lesson. Improvisation works best when it's practiced. This knowledge is especially, I'd say, relevant during natural disasters, grid failures, or even remote travel. The World War II scrap metal still teaches us that safe water is achievable without technology, provided the fundamentals are understood. So, what does this quiet innovation actually say about wartime survival? Well, this still represents the uncelebrated intelligence of ordinary people under extreme pressure. It wasn't elegant, fast, or in many cases officially sanctioned, but it was effective. It turned scrap into life. Understanding these details, honestly, just deepens our appreciation of how survival really unfolded during the war, far from those command tents and strategy maps. If this deep dive into World War II backyard wisdom added something real to your understanding, do subscribe to the channel and share this guide with others who value practical history. These lessons, they endure only if we keep them alive.